Thank you. The survey is in
the chat.
link is in the chat.
Yeah. Let's take about 3 minutes to do this. Please, no Googling, no peeking. It will ask for your email address to get the form, but note that when we look at the responses, we are not recording anybody's specific email address. So we don't know who's going to say what. To access the form, you will need to log in with your Gramener ID though. But responses are not being recorded against your email address. So this is basically what we call the factfulness quiz. It's part of Hans Rosling's book on factfulness. Not just his book, but pretty much his entire career, the work that he has done in public health and policy research. That sort of is consolidated in this quiz. And this is essentially supposed to be a test of how well you know the world. So let's find out. And we are going to take some examples from this and go into even more examples, even more stories, and then play, then have more interactions based on this. That is broadly what this is about. And if you're done answering the questions, please either raise your hand or just let us know.
So far we got 5 responses.
Okay, great. Vamsi is done.
2 people scored 7 so far.
Okay.
So 2 of them have scored 2.
Okay, great.
We have a bunch of folks who are they scored a 3 out of 8, 4, 5, 6.
Okay.
Sorry guys. Sorry for joining late. Sorry.
No, not at all, Pranil. So Pranil, there is a link in the chat window, which is a small quiz that we would like you to take. I'm just resharing it. For the people who have joined in earlier, okay, Bhanu is also done. Please take this quiz. Shouldn't take you too long, and please no peeking.
Sure. Let me guess.
There is a very specific point we're trying to make with this.
Jaydev, now that you said no peeking, full disclaimer, I've read the book, so
that's fine. That's fine.
You read the book and you got an 8?
I think I got 7. I don't know.
I was able to figure that out.
I read the book, but I don't remember answer to 2 or 3 questions now.
Anand, you have company.
Sandeep, actually, you answered the quiz yesterday, but without reading the book also, you were on the positive side.
Yeah.
Significantly.
I think Sandeep is a big optimist in that case.
Yeah. We have 17 responses so far. Let's give it 30 more seconds, Jaydev.
Sure.
19. So far, 7 of the 20 participants scored 2. There are only 2 people who got a 7.
Okay.
1 got a 6. 2 of them got a 5. The majority of the curve is with 2 and 3 right answers, Jaydev.
Yeah. Good. So I will be able to make my point, or Rosling's point.
Rosling's point, rather, yeah.
Actually,
so
no.
I think we're good.
I was like, what if everybody cracks this quiz? I will have nothing to say for the next 30 minutes.
At least.
No, I think that's the same point that Rosling makes even in his book, right?
Yeah.
He kept believing that maybe people will do better, but they don't.
They don't. Yeah.
So the sample says that Rosling looked at, and this group has resemblance.
Yeah, but this group is supposed to be better because of what we do, and that's kind of the point. So anyway, I guess PSU people should have cracked this like anything.
Yeah, Anand Madhav, 3.
Now you're getting personal.
No, I have not submitted my question. If you want, I can submit my responses. Because see, one of the interesting thing is Bill Gates keeps on sharing Hans Rosling's books finding every now and then in his Gates notes. So yeah. I get email alerts. So
EPF has been mentioned 3 times in this book, by the way.
Yeah, and he says this is his most favorite book in last 10 years or so.
Right. So anyway, can we let me just refresh this page, and it tells me there are 21 responses, there are 38 responses, and let's see. Now we have, I think let's continue. We are already, unfortunately my fault that we are a little late. Zoom decided to crack up on me. So anyway, 37% of us think that, only 40% or 20% girls finish primary school. The correct answer is 60%. And only a quarter of us think that, less than 33%. So if you were to pick this answer by random, you are doing worse than random, right? Most of us anyway. Where does the majority of the world live? Okay, this one everybody got right. Most of us, majority of the world lives in middle income countries, but a lot of us got it horrendously wrong, which is low income countries. In fact, a minority of the world lives in low income countries. Most of us are in middle income countries. In the last 20 years, the population of the world living in extreme poverty has most people say that it has remained more or less the same, but the correct answer again is it has almost halved. Who can see a pattern over here? Feel free to unmute yourself and comment at any time. What is the life expectancy of the world? Most of us think it's 60 years. Some of us think it's 70 years, and some of us think it's 50 years. The answer is 70 years. So who can see a pattern?
I think things are a bit more positive than maybe we think they are.
Yes, and this is the same point that Rosling and Bill Gates both make, that we think world is a bad place, but world is increasingly getting better than what it was 50 or 100 years ago, and it will continue to get better.
Number of deaths per year from natural disasters, it has decreased to less than half, a little over 33%. How many of the world's 1-year-old children today have been vaccinated against some disease? More or less or uniformly correct or incorrect answers. The answer is 84%, 80%, right? Global climate experts believe that over the next 100 years, the average temperature will get warmer. Okay, so this one we would get right, because this is the only depressing fact in Rosling's entire questionnaire. How many people have access to some electricity? Again, 80%. So here's basically the point. Many of us in many questions, we beat chimpanzees. So Rosling keeps making these comparisons that he presents the same questionnaire with the same data that is available to most of the world through United Nations, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and so on. These are fairly solid authorities on this data. And he made this presentation he asked these questions to people across all walks of life. These were politicians, policy researchers, policy makers, professors in the same domains, CEOs of the largest companies in the world, middle class people, poor people, everybody. He has basically presented this questionnaire to everyone, no matter how unaware or how educated you are. Everybody shows that same pattern. We not only get the world wrong, devastatingly wrong, but we get it systematically wrong. All of us are we tend to make things more negative than they are. We tend to interpret things in the more negative sense. And he says that it's worse than if we had no knowledge at all. He keeps coming up with this analogy of, if you actually catch a random chimpanzee and give him 3 bananas titled A, B, and C, even the chimpanzees will do better than humans if they were to pick the answers random. So basically the reason for this is that our worldview tends to be very dramatic. We don't like normal things. We don't like positive things, or there is a lot of negativity in the way we consume information, the way we consume media in general, and that is what broadly this talk is about. So how do you fix this? So why do we know less about the world than chimps, supposedly? Because we have divided the world between us and them. So there is one of the major reasons he calls out why people get the world wrong is what he calls the gap instinct. So you see that on the left, we have a bubble chart where on the x-axis you have babies per woman, and on the y-axis you have child mortality. So child mortality is essentially defined as number of children who live up to or who die before the age of 5. And for number of children who die before the age of 5, for every 1,000 children born, that's basically the child mortality of a country. Obviously, you can see that India and China are the 2 biggest bubbles here. And this is the scenario as it was in 1965. And this was almost around the time when Cold War was peaking and so on. The Second World War had ended, and it had given us a very clear distinction in the world. There was always an us versus them, right? There was a developed world, there was a developing world. The problem is that we are still stuck with those stereotypes. We still think of ourselves as the third world. We still think of majority of Africa as the third world, right? And because that happens, this has started impacting businesses, this has started impacting policy, and so many other things that we do on a day-to-day basis. Stereotypes haven't changed, and one of the, as statisticians or data storytellers or a data scientist, whatever you want to call it, when your data changes, your beliefs also have to change, right? That hasn't happened. If you look at 2018, you'll see that most, at least when you think about babies and babies per woman and child mortality per country, most of the countries from the developing box have moved away into the developed world, right? So you can see that the two biggest boxes are down here. We are choosing to have less children, and our children are surviving longer. There again, I wouldn't say that one causes the other. Obviously, we can't. But the correlation also means something. If you have only a limited number of children, it's more likely that they'll survive because you'll be able to care for them better and so on. And this has been, you can see that there is a very clear trend, that is, it's almost more or less a straight line over here, whereas here it was completely random. So that stereotype made sense back then. Now it doesn't. And these are just two metrics. There are so many other things across which we make these stereotypes. And the gap is just not necessarily between developed and developing. It could be versus anything. It could be you can see these patterns in North India versus South India, upper caste versus lower caste, BJP versus Congress, all of them. You see, the problem with the gap instinct is that it forces you to pick a side, whereas while you completely forget the fact that you don't have to pick a side, and you, for the most part, are a fairly average person who's squarely between either extreme. In fact, you're not in any extreme at all, right? So that is the problem with the gap instinct, right? So the next thing that he talks about is something called negativity extinct. Why do we think that the things are getting better? Well, obviously because it's negativity that sells, more or less. The kind of content we when something is normal, when something isn't alarming, it doesn't catch any eyeballs. Panic does, or fear does, or tragedy does, right? So you can see that consistently there are a lot of things that have gotten better over time. Oil spills, recently when there was a major oil spill in the Pacific, just before that, David Attenborough's documentaries had started airing on Netflix. And suddenly people who consume Netflix, which by the way is a very small fraction of the global population, became very woke, and they started becoming very responsive towards things like oil spills. But if you put that in the historical context, only about 40 years ago or so, look at the kind of oil spills we had and look at how rapidly they have decreased, right? Children dying before their 5th birthday, child mortality overall globally has gotten better, and it's going to keep getting better because that matters. Healthy children is the single biggest predictor of the overall health of any particular group of people, whether it is a country, culture, or whatever, a specific region. Pick any group of people, and their child mortality is easily the best predictor of their overall health. If you can't keep your children safe, there's nothing much you can do about anybody else's health, right? Deaths from natural or man-made disasters again has gone down. And similarly, if you think about a few positive things, democracy has gone up a lot. Girls spending time in school have a share of girls in primary school age. Only about 50 years ago, it was only 65%. Now it's all the way up to 90%. So basically 9 out of 10 girls are in primary school today, which is significant. And this is important because the female education again seems to be the single biggest driving factor of overall literacy and education or performance of a family. This we also know from the 10th standard, the Tamil Nadu state SSC analysis that we did, that the mother's occupation tends to have a larger impact than any other factor in the marks that a child gets, right? Child cancer survival has gone all the way from 58% just in a matter of 20 to 35 years, by about 22%. That is significantly higher risk. And this is, why are we talking about these things? So again, Hans Rosling says this very interesting thing, that culture and freedoms are the goals of development, but they are hard to measure. But guitars per capita is a good proxy for that, right? So these are only 6 items, 3 bad things that have gotten less frequent, and 3 good things that have gotten better. But if you go to this particular thing, you'll find a lot more examples of 16 things, 16 negative things that have been going down and 16 positive things that have been going up, right? So this is also a good, checklist to have whenever you see something which has a thoroughly tragic or a, overly negative implication to it. Then, maybe just use the negativity instinct as a filter against that, right? Or avoid the negativity instinct, in other words. So let's continue. He also says that statistics is a kind of therapy. As long as people have a worldview that is much more negative than reality, pure statistics can make you feel a lot positive. Simply look at the data. Whenever you find a piece of really terrible news, just look at the data and you'll see that maybe it's not as bad as it is made out to be. Now, there again, and very emphatically, we must make this point that just because overall things are good in the world doesn't mean that we can excuse a standalone oil spill or a standalone case of say 40 children died because of lack of oxygen in a particular place. But it's the intent here is not to trivialize or not to downplay that particular accident. What we are trying to say here is that things can be both bad and better at the same time. And because we realize that they can be bad and better at the same time, we can figure out what made them better and apply it to the bad. So it doesn't have to be an either or kind of a worldview. And here when I was writing this, I remembered this particular episode of South Park. It's called Child Abduction is Not Funny, where this episode is specifically about how the media tries to amplify things that are negative. Not just the media, but a lot of us. We do it ourselves, right? We'll come up about the role of media later in this session. But we try to amplify a lot of negative things, right? So what happens is that in this episode, the town of South Park, there is a rumor of child abduction going on, and people, obviously parents, get very scared because of that, so they try to lock up their children and everything. And finally the children become very suspicious of the world outside. They won't help strangers, or they won't talk to strangers. They will not even they can see that there is this kid called Tweak, and he can see that people are dying, but he won't go out and help them. So finally this character appears to him. He calls himself the ghost of human kindness, and he says that that the world as you see on media is not the world as it is. There are tons of examples out here where people are helping each other out of just pure kindness, and there's nothing else. But you are never going to hear about that on the news. The only thing you're going to hear about is how adults are something to be viewed suspiciously only, right? But South Park tends to be very subversive. So in the classic subversive way that they do things, it turns out that this character itself is a child abductor in disguise. So anyway, I mean that's what they do in every episode. They make a point and then they make fun of themselves for having made that point a certain way. So I think there are a couple of messages on chat. Let me just check it out. Okay. So one who has posted attributes of impact of different attributes on education. You can check it out on gramino.com/NAS. All right. So let's continue. So yeah, statistics as a therapy. This is more data is available to us now, and you can very easily try to validate or invalidate certain negative ideas. Most likely, always try to as we have seen in the quiz that we took in the beginning, we tend to have a worldview that is more negative and more dramatic, which is not always the case. Global warming is real bad. So here we come to the first, check against this sort of. We've covered what causes bad knowledge; it's the stereotype. But the next thing that usually causes bad analytics is bad data. And here again, we are going to have a poll. So Sandeep, could we have the poll one, please? Yeah. Please take a poll. It's a short question.
Jitha, I shared the responses link in chat. You can open that up.
All right. Am I not logged in or?
One moment.
Okay, let me try and open this incognito. So, oh, it doesn't even ask me to log in.
Okay, Jaydev, we have 13 responses. 69% are voting for bank employee and 37 for shopkeeper. So majority bank employee at the moment.
Okay, how many employees did you say? How many? Sorry, how many responses?
19 responses so far.
Okay.
63% bank employee.
All right. There's also
36
quite many
shopkeeper.
people. Would you please, folks, participate? It's just one question, so just think about it, or or don't, and just let us know your answer. Basically, the question is this: that I'm describing my uncle. He's in his late 40s. He has a balding head. He keeps to himself. Doesn't like to be nosy. Doesn't like being disturbed. He can get very irritable. What is the likely profession of this person? Let's wait for not more than a minute.
Sandeep, could you refresh once?
We have 22 responses now. Roughly 60-40 split, Jaydev. Bank employee 60, 40 shopkeeper.
Okay. So let me, for people who have voted either way, let me tell you this. The Ministry of Labor says that as of 2017, shopkeepers are 5 times more common than bank employees. Would you change your answer? If you would, just maybe type yes.
What do you mean by common, Jaydev? That means there are 5 times as many shopkeepers.
Yeah, there are 5 times as many
there.
shopkeepers as there are bank employees.
You should have started with a probability class before asking the question.
So Charitarth says he wouldn't change his answer. Who would change their answer?
Is it a lunchtime in the bank?
Graminer one, whoever that is, says no, you wouldn't change your answer.
When faced with facts, you are more likely to back your own instinct.
True that.
Facts don't matter. It's once you comply, publicly commit to an answer, you're more likely to stick to it.
Thanks for pointing that out. So in the US Congress, this question was asked to one of their economists called Paul Samuelson. And what used to happen is that he was also, just like, these Zuckerberg and who's that? Jack Dorsey. He went to Congress to testify against how algorithms are controlling stuff, and they had to clarify that no, we are not that company. That company is some other company. I'm Google. iPhones are built by some other company. So he used to get called to Congress to testify just like that. And every time he went there, he would say something new, completely contradictory to what he used to say earlier. So one of the senators, they asked him, you are not consistent. Why do you keep changing your responses every time? So he said, boss, when my data changes, I change my opinions. Why don't you do that? So yeah, why should we change our opinion given that bank employees are 5 times less likely to be found than shopkeepers? Or should we at all? I mean, what do you think is the correct answer? Should we change our opinion? Should we not? Either way, would anybody like to take a shot at why?
Jaydev, I'll take a shot.
Please.
Sandeep. We should at least consider a revision of our answer, reevaluate the decision. Whether we change the answer eventually or not is secondary, but willingness to reconsider the evaluation is what I would think.
Precisely. This is a classic experiment that was carried out by 2 behavioral economists called Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. So they carried out a very similar experiment, and they came up with exactly the same results. That forget about updating your beliefs based on new information that is presented. the fact that there could be more data out there is something that doesn't even strike most people, right? This is what is called the availability heuristic or selection bias, right? So we tend to make our opinions based on the data that we have ready with us. One of the other questions that they also asked as a part of the same study was, which is more common, words that begin with the letter K or words that have the third character as the letter K? Since obviously you can name more words which begin with the letter K than the other case, which is words that have third character as the letter K, like ask or acknowledge. Everybody said that, you know, the first category is more frequent, but it's not. Words that have the third character as the letter K are a lot more frequent. So this is called either the availability heuristic or selection bias and so on, right? So this is basically an example of, sorry, I think I went back a slide too quickly. This is an example of what happens, you know, when your data isn't correctly sampled, when it is not stratified, when you create your opinions based on whatever is available only to you. Another example is that how many people have seen The Social Dilemma so far?
I have.
I've seen halfway through.
Correct. I guess most of us have seen it, right? And do you feel like people are being super woke about this for no reason?
Yeah, I don't know. It's good to clarify what you mean by woke. Again, that's coming from your universe.
Yeah, well, people are being hyper reactive towards this. It's like, oh my God, this is terrible, and this is, well, I'm not
I mean,
talking about
I'm
the fact that the addiction.
surprised that why was it so shocking? I mean, we knew all of this. I mean, most of us did. Maybe people were shocked because it's reminder.
I haven't seen the movie, but I do believe people who describe themselves as woke are generally hyperreactive.
Well, I didn't mean it like that. I shouldn't stereotype, of course. It's what I'm trying to say is that it's it had that effect of you know, somebody trying to provoke people into reacting towards it, which it may not. It may have been a very well-intentioned documentary, which I believe it was. Their commentary about you know, how there are social networks that are engineered to make you addicts to them is spot on. That is what it is. We work in that field more or less. We are data scientists ourselves. We know that we want nothing more than to capture the customer's attention, right? That's how we make designs. You know, we figure out what can be more eye-catching, and we tend to amplify those effects. But I don't think that, you know, the projection that it had, that, you know, this is pushing the world into jeopardy and all that, I think that was a little exaggerated. And why I think that is that because the people who are basically reacting to, well, the social dilemma or its message, maybe one of the things that we must take into account that these are exactly the Netflix audience. These are people who already have access to Netflix, which means that it's likely reasonable to assume that these are people who are more active on social media themselves. Majority of mankind may not be. Most people don't spend too much time on Twitter beyond watching videos or, you know, jokes or memes or something like that. People don't participate in, most people at least, do not participate in political conversations on social media. Most people aren't there to consume or produce content, right? Most people are there simply because they have really cheap internet. And those people are not likely to have Netflix accounts. So, you know, if you find yourself being very aggravated at something like the social media, you could be a part of a very small. That's basically my inference. I could be wrong. I would love to do the math, of course. So yeah, it's basically the idea is that, you know, selection bias is a very real thing. Availability heuristic is a very real, right? And that is what leads to a lot of pseudoscience and fake news. And here's an example of that. So this is you know, picture from a book from 1876 called Criminal Faces, right? Or La Homme Criminelle. That is basically this fellow, Cesar Lombroso. He tried to predict criminal activity by looking at people's faces. He said that criminal, you know, intent or criminal tendencies, they show up on somebody's face and they end up, becoming very apparent through your facial features. So this is an example of how, you sample something and you try to come up with a pattern because you have to, and then you present it. There was also a field of pseudoscience back then called Phrenology, which said that you could predict somebody's psychological characteristics by measuring the size of their heads and skulls. In fact, the first phrenology mentions, or when it was popularized, it appeared, there are two phrenologists who appear in Sherlock Holmes stories. And Sherlock Holmes is the first person who says to them, okay, this is BS. Maybe you're just trying to fit your data into your theories, not the other way around. You're not changing your theories to fit the data. So there are, I don't remember the names of the stories, but there are two such occasions on which phrenology was debunked by Arthur Conan Doyle itself through fiction, right? And sadly, there is a modern version of it. There was a paper by a couple of Chinese scientists called Wu and Zhang. They said automated inference on criminality using face images, right? This is the abstract, where they said that this is this system, this deep learning system of identifying criminal intent is better than a judge having to, pronounce a verdict of guilty or not guilty, or even predict something like, the minority report sort of thing, because there are no inherent biases, race, religion, political doctrine, gender, etc. These are big claims to make. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? You can't, and especially when you go into the paper has been, by the way, it has been redacted since, and they have issued clarifications, but not an apology exactly. What they ended up figuring out was that this d, theta, and rho, these are the three metrics that the neural network ended up learning about a person's face, and that is what ended up mattering in whether in the prediction of criminal versus non-criminal. What they decided that what they ended up inferring from their analysis is that this angle theta, which is like if you take if you draw your lines down from the nostrils to the corners of your mouth, this angle is usually smaller for criminals and it's very wide for non-criminals. Any idea why that would be?
Where did they get the data from? Is it like mugshots versus passport photos or something?
Yes.
Yeah. Nobody would laugh in a mugshot.
Right. They look like they're smiling in the bottom ones.
Yeah. These are non-criminals. These are criminals. Nobody is going to be smiling in mugshots. Almost everybody will be smiling in their passport photos. They said that they got the non-criminal data from government-issued ID cards, and the criminal data was taken from prisons. Obviously, the model learned that, right? So again, classic example of selection bias, right? There it is. Matters where you are, and it's also it shows up in where you are all over the internet. So this is basically when you type "my husband is," these are the suggestions that you get on Google, whereas these are the suggestions you get on Facebook. Why is that? Any idea? Here you see it's overwhelmingly negative. My husband is overweight and lazy, always yelling at her daughter, not into sex, and cheating on me and that sort of stuff. Whereas on Facebook, things are overwhelmingly positive.
Yes,
You
people might
try to show off over social media, whereas when you search, you go for a negative thing only.
Exactly. When I'm in trouble,
also searching is private, maybe.
Jay, what is the second last response on Google search? What does that mean? I'm just curious.
My husband is my professor and boss novel. I think it's a novel. My husband is my professor and boss.
Oh, okay.
Perhaps. I don't know. That seems like that. Yeah, I mean, when you're on Facebook, there is no way you're going to let people know that things are not exactly right between you and your husband, right? But if you are in trouble, if I have any sort of a problem, it could be as simple as an unexplained pain in some part of my body. I'm just going to, the first thing I'm going to do is open up an incognito tab and Google it, right? So depending on where you draw your data from, you can paint very different pictures of the world, right? It's exactly like four blind people trying to touch an elephant and trying to figure out whether it's an elephant. Right. So the last poll for today, again, about the availability heuristic. Let's try that out. Sandeep, could you please share it?
There you go. It's up.
Again, smallish enough question. You don't have to think too much about it. By the way, when answering this question, assume that you yourself are very average on both the attractiveness and the niceness scale.
I think that needs a little elaboration. Jaydev adjusting his glasses. Classic you. Yeah, we have responses flowing in. 16 members so far.
Okay.
68% disagree, 31% agree.
What, only 38%? What?
Yeah, we have 22 responses.
Hmm.
68% disagree, rest agree.
Okay, interesting.
Because we are learning the theme you are setting in this session.
Yeah. There are two
No,
biases
but
actually.
Jaydev, isn't it in line with what the conventional, like, at least in common parlance we talk about, right?
What do you mean?
For example, let's take a similar thing. In our culture, most Indian cultures, we assume somebody has a lot of wealth or money. And if they are nice, that's extra point. People talk, oh, he's so rich or famous, but still he's so nice.
Still nice,
right?
Yeah.
Because the underlying assumption is if you are rich or if you are popular, you are not likely to be nice, and you are an exception. That's why, for example, think of all the 70s. If people who've seen Bollywood movies, all the 70s movies, the villain was rich, and not only rich, all of them were extremely bad people.
Yeah.
Right.
But they were exactly the one
so-
who were rich. Like rich people good, bad people, poor people bad. Yeah.
Yeah. So because that was the underlying socialist theme that was prevalent that
But
time.
this is that is true, and this has nothing to do with that though. I'm trying to statistically prove that that is true. So let's see why that happens. Let us say that you have some scale for attractiveness. People to the left here are not attractive. People to the right are attractive. And similarly, there is some scale on the niceness scale. People below this scale are not nice. People higher up on the scale are nice. These are 500 individuals, say. Now you see that there is no correlation between them. And again, assume that you are square in the center of this scatter plot. You are moderately nice, you're moderately attractive. That is, you're not too attractive, you're not a supermodel. At the same time, you're not terrible looking. You are not too rude. You're just maybe a very quiet person or something like that, like a very average person, right? Now let's see what happens, like especially in the context of relationships or dating. This is what would happen. Let's say that this triangle represents the people who are neither nice nor attractive. You would never want to interact with them. They're already, like, you would not talk to them because they're, well, you wouldn't talk to them because they are not nice in the first place, but at the same time, you're not likely to have, say, you're not likely to date them or marry them because they're not attractive for some reason. They're neither of them. So both those things amplify. At the same time, there is an upper triangle which says they're too nice or too attractive. Therefore, they wouldn't want to date you. So these are people that you have rejected. These are people that are rejecting you, right? Now, because that happens for most people who are average, by the way, who occupy this space, if you drop off both these corners and you see the correlation coefficient is very small, in fact, almost negative, right? But when you drop off these people, when you filter out these people, what remains is this. And that's a very strong negative correlation. So yes, I mean, if we believe that niceness and attractiveness are actually negative correlated, there is actually a selection bias. That is actually selection bias at play. That's because we are talking about things that are available to us, and most of us are average people, right? The same thing plays out in recruitment as well. Lots of recruiters, and Sandeep can maybe back me up here one way or another. I would be happy to know your input on this. Lot of recruiters, a lot of people in the HR industry believe that, you know, most people do very well in interviews or whatever your recruitment process is, whether it is entrance exams, whether it is, you know, have you done GSOC, have you won a Kaggle competition, do you have a certification, whatever it is, that is something that people are good at cracking. But finally, when they end up in the workplace, they don't do so well. In fact, the better they do in the recruitment process, the worse they do as long-term employees. Same is true with, I have a friend who's a professor at IIT Bombay who runs a rehabilitation center for people who don't do very well in IITs, students who don't do very well in IITs. And he consistently comes up with this result, that these are exactly the students who do very well in JEE. So why don't they do well in IIMs? This is the reason. Because, this is also called Bergson's paradox, where, exclusion of certain groups makes it seem like what you are trying to measure is exactly what got gained, right? Sandeep, what do you think? Do you think this makes sense in recruitment? There is,
Generalization is a little challenge, Jadip. It would not play out. I would rather look at it this way. In our, at least in the limited context of the data if I talk about from the last 6 years, if you see someone who's really acing every question you ask, which means they have prepped for that very well.
Yeah.
An outlier performance is what kind of I would be inclined to align to what you said.
Yeah.
But in general, if you're doing a mix, it's still not easy to pin you in one category. But if someone hits everything out of the park, then you start getting a little jittery. And again, this also accounts only for folks you are looking at 3 to 5 year experience level. Beyond that, it becomes a case of holistic ability validation.
Right.
So it does not fit into this mold. So this criteria about acing test and all only comes to some level, because after that your measurement is on not only on your technical ability but your intrapersonal and other situational behavior, which is not that easy to
do
game.
Yeah. Which is not easy to game, and that's interesting because not everybody would do that.
Sandeep, when you say, Sandeep, you mentioned something over prepared. Is that perceived to be a bad thing if somebody is giving like all the answers to all your questions?
Not over prepared, Anand. Let's say you are evaluating someone in a skill or entry level with a lower experience threshold.
Okay.
There, the expectation would be that when you run through a set of questions, let's say there are 10 questions, you answer all 10 questions without flinching at a rapid pace of like this is this. Then you essentially fall into that outlier bucket at that point in time. You answering 10 questions is not the problem, Anand. So if
It's
that's
just
the
that you
impression I
happen
give.
to know them and not that you applied yourself then and there. Is that
correct? That is a
okay?
distinction we've taken, because what the point Jayden and I were leaning on was you acing the test. That is the piece we were referring to. That acing can be you preparing before and saying this is the thing I need to answer versus this is how I would approach it and get to the answer. So
Maybe
that
one
distinction
factor
is
could
what we
also
are
be
getting.
that because you've done so well, expectations are already high from you, and obviously anything below your 100% is going to be viewed as subpar.
Got it.
That could be one factor.
Okay, I want to make a statement here. Both you, Jaydev and Anand, you have been in the you're closer to the system where 99.95 is what you need for the next admission. You're in that ecosystem, so I'll abstain the next statement.
True. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Let's say you can choose between two surgeons, and one tells you, okay, you can look at my record. I have 1,899 successful surgeries, so you can take me. Or there's another surgeon who says, well, I've done it once and it went okay. So would you rather not take the over-prepared one?
Of course I would.
Yeah, so just an opinion. Maybe that's not such a bad thing.
Sure, but there aren't any here in this case. In your example, we are not talking about two orthogonal skills or scales at all.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, absolutely, their performance matters more. If you are also talking
Jaydev,
about yes.
Yeah, just a quick question on that. Would not aren't we also comparing creative fields and non-creative fields in that matter? Because
sorry, are we also comparing what?
Creative fields and non-creative fields, because let's say for a doctor is not expected to be creative, or let's say a site reliability engineer would not. It's not a site reliability, but let's say a doctor would be expected to be not be creative, while an engineer might need to have that ability. So maybe we would be comparing apple and oranges.
No, where exactly are we comparing apples and oranges?
No, so let's say if I'm trying to interview and if I'm trying to look for creativity as a skill or as an attribute in you as for a candidate, then I want you to think about stuff and then come up with it and not be out. Well,
yeah, that would be a badly designed interview. Yes. If indeed creativity is something that doctors shouldn't have, I don't think that is the case. Doctors can be creative, and that could be a positive thing for them. But anyway, I mean, not to take your example literally, but if you are actually measuring things that you are not looking for in candidates, then clearly it's a badly designed. Anyway, so we are almost out of time, but let's wrap up with the third pillar of bad analytics, which is bad interpretation of data. The biggest examples of this that we see are bad data visualization, and this is basically the most common and one of the favorite things that we talk about. There is this phenomenon of chart junk, which is basically adding extra fluff to a chart which has nothing to do with the underlying message. So for example, one thing that is wrong with this particular graphic is that the bar charts are tilted, and because they are tilted, I can't compare. Any bar on the fourth to the right is going to appear less than correspondingly on the left, even though it might not be. In general, 3D is a bad idea. 3D bar charts are just generally a bad idea, because whatever is closer to you in the 3 dimension appears larger than whatever is farther, just like this thing over here and this thing over here, right? So you have a 3D bar chart over here and you have a 3D pie chart over here. Pie chart themselves are, as it is, not looked upon as exactly the best ways of showing proportions. But if you make it 3D, you'll see that this particular slice, which in this case happens to be 50%, but you see that it looks bigger than 50%, suggesting that Android occupies more than half the market, but it may not, right? Even in this case, you see that this particular line, which denotes 100%, is looking bigger than this particular line, which denotes 100%. So Edward Tufte has a bunch of literature about this, and there are laws of data visualization that he has laid out. One of the things that he frequently mentions is something called the data to ink ratio. So the ink that you have on your chart has to be proportional to the kind of data, to the amount of information you're conveying. It shouldn't be more than that. And this isn't exactly, you might believe that this is just aesthetics, but there is a reason why those exist. That is because, if you don't follow them, or if there is a lot of this unnecessary fluff in your charts, you could be conveying misleading messages, right? And that's just, these are examples of, non-malicious data visualization. There can be very malicious data visualization as well. So for example, this was one very popular chart, which was titled "The Only Climate Change Chart You'll Ever Need." And look at that, it doesn't look very alarming. What is the problem with this?
Scaling of the y-axis.
Right. What this guy is saying is that the average global temperature scale change by only, maybe a few degrees here and there. But, as humans, we know that just a few degrees here and there is likely to make you very sick. If your temperature increases by just 2 degrees, you have fever. If it increases by 4 degrees or 6 degrees, you have to be admitted. More than that, you're likely dead. So even that few degrees, and you don't want to boil water over here. You want to maintain Earth's temperature. So this doesn't make sense. So then people responded with this chart, which is actually the real chart. And you see, it's only a degree or so of change in the last few decades. But we can tolerate it as humans. The idea is that the ecosystem can't. You have no clue what sort of animals can't regulate their body temperature as well as we can. Most animals can't. Higher animals can, amphibians cannot, reptiles cannot, birds cannot. So the point was that, that chart is thoroughly misleading. Anyway, this is another very interesting example, top 10 most read books in the world. And you see that what this person has done is that to the bar, they have added the title of the book itself, which makes the bar look larger than it is. So basically, the Diary of Anne Frank, if I look at it without reading too much in detail and without reading too carefully, I'll see that, okay, the sales of the Diary of Anne Frank is only 40% or so of the sales of the Bible, which doesn't make sense at all, right? And you see that they have put design where it doesn't belong. They have put extra design where it doesn't belong. Look at the way they have written Harry Potter or the Twilight Saga. So, you might think that, okay, it's a constant hike that has been added to every bar, but that does distort the proportionality. So for example, look at, the Diary of Anne Frank versus the Da Vinci Code. This one has twice as many sales, but they look very similar because you are adding this huge chunk of height to each bar, right? This is another classic example of bad data.
I'd also like to add another misinterpretation on the books one.
Yeah.
That wording matters too, because over there it said the number of books read. Whereas in the case of the Bible, most of those sales goes to hotel rooms where it's just kept, not necessarily read. So could this be considered as a
most
bad?
read books in the world? But look at the scale here: in millions of copies sold in the last 50 years. But
Right,
I mean, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that okay, if you're going to buy a book, then maybe you're going to read it as well, because
So we can apply balance of probability to analytics like this and consider it's an okay. Yeah, okay.
of course, unless there are books which are being sold for the express purpose of being there and not being read, like coffee table books, for example. You don't read every page of a or encyclopedias. You don't read encyclopedias start to end like novels, right? So yeah, there it applies.
Right.
Jene, one point I want to make, like I agree to you that some or other way we just try to show the wrong figures through the charts and figures what we choose. But don't you think that nowadays the business requirement is in such a way that we are too much inclined towards making a graph catchy or eye catchy or look attractive? We are inclined towards that so much that we give up on the beauty of actual charts. So no one actually gives a shit about if you draw a simple bar chart, they say that what is this? But if you give some 3D touch and stuff, they will like it. Oh wow, factor.
Agreed.
So that's also
so this to a large extent cannot be helped, but when you are at the receiving end of this, maybe you can be more careful, because this clearly means that somebody is trying to sell something that isn't really real. When you have to do it, you have to do it, unfortunately. So but of course, like I mean, beyond a point, people do realize that this is just fluff. All right, so this is something that suggests that it looks like a Venn diagram, but it's not really a Venn diagram. So this is an example of incompatible grammar of graphics versus what type of narrative you're trying to build, right? All right. So this is just a little bit of content about fake news and mass media. There is an amazing web podcast called Econ Central, which unfortunately shut down. And they had an episode called Out or Nothing Arna, which is where they explained why mass media behaves the way they do. What used to happen is that, when we had cable coming from some local guy, he would have a monopoly over that entire locality, and they would basically charge anything they wanted. So then what Try did was they started imposing caps on channels. So channels couldn't charge customers more than a certain 5 rupees per month or something to get their revenue up. So the only thing that they could do is grow their customers, which is why they ended up, trying to grab eyeballs. And this, by the way, is not even an artifact of modern times. A lot of us believe that this started post 2014. Not at all. If you go back and if you look at some of the news, India TV or any other news channels before that, you'll see that there were all sorts of nonsense on news for a fairly long time. In fact, in the afternoon, they used to just show daily soaps again, right? So that is that there are economic, systemic reasons for why mass media behaves the way they, And secondly, just clickbait. Correlation doesn't sell newspapers. So when you see a correlation, you have to say that it is causation. Whether it actually is causation or not is something for, by the time the news is viral, it doesn't matter. So, there is this other book through which I compiled some of this content. It says that, the truth, while the truth is just putting on his shoes, lies have already completed one round across the world. So, and there is also something called Goodwin's law, which says that the amount of effort required to debunk bullshit is exponentially more than the effort required to create bullshit. Such is the state of affairs, but all we can do is be careful about it. Finally, let me conclude with some recipes to avoid bad analytics. You say, always ask these three things: who is telling me something, how do they know it, and what are they trying to sell me? Everybody's obviously trying to sell us something or the other. Avoid the gap instinct. Remember that the biggest differentiator of people is not culture, religion, society, anything. It's basically just income. And this has all sorts of implications. One of my favorite examples from Hans Rosling's book was that most companies spend their marketing money in trying to mine markets that are already at their peak. They don't realize that a lot of countries have moved from the developing bubble to the developed bubble. There are women who are having fewer and fewer children, which means, and by the way, he quotes a very interesting statistic that every successful pregnancy that is carried to term, results in 2 years worth of menstruation loss, which means that if you are Procter and Gamble or somebody like that, you have this big market over here, which earlier you did not. And just because of stereotypes or just because of the gap instinct, you simply miss out on that market, while you are simply trying to send the same things to the same people over and over again, right? Secondly, avoid hypes of all kinds. Everything has been done before. That has to be the baseline assumption. When the first printing presses came out, people said that books are going to destroy knowledge because the only people who owned books at the time were churches and royalty. And obviously, the church panicked because now everybody would start reading the Bible. So, and they would have their own interpretations, which is why Protestantism came in. And they said that, this technology is going to destroy the world. At the same time, there were people who says that this technology is going to transform the world. One of them is always right. So no big deal again, right? When in the 17th century, Henry VIII of England, he started experimenting with blast furnaces, which created a new type of metal called cast iron. Well, it wasn't exactly a new type of metal, but he figured out a way to create lighter and cheaper cannons based on it. Lighter and cheaper cannons meant that you could put them on ships to replace bronze cannons, which were very expensive and very heavy. That meant lighter warships, that meant a lighter fleet of ships. That is precisely what it was one of the catalysts in allowing England to basically outrank the French and the Spanish navies very quickly, relatively. They had been around for a much longer time, but Britain was able to capture them very quickly. Many historians romanticize this and say that that is the reason why we are speaking English today, right? Could be true, could not be true. Same thing happened during the semiconductor revolution. In one corridor of Bell Labs in AT&T, there was William Shockley and I think John Bardeen, who were doing the research on semiconductors. On the other corridor, there was Claude Shannon, who was working on the mathematics behind communication. Very rarely it happens that the hardware and the software is both there in the same time. Both of them exploded and caused what we know to be the semiconductor revolution. And therefore, the age of information is what came out. And that's the same thing that people say about the AI revolution as well. When the first perceptron model came out in the 50s, it is just alarming how, if you actually go back and look at the magazine articles from that time, which appeared in Scientific American and Nature and Science and so on, they are identical to the way we see things today. GPT-3 comes out, it's going to change the world. NVIDIA launches new GPU, AI is going to change the world, is something we see so often. It's eerie, it's uncanny how similar the discourse was, at least in the media, back in the 50s when the first perceptrons came out. But the perceptrons started getting arranged into multiple layers, so they created backpropagation, and they said, okay, hey, this is something that's capable of learning so many new patterns. But then there was a block where they realized that they couldn't apply it to language very efficiently or even vision very efficiently, because they had to hand engineer features and that. And then there was a 20-year break, after which convolutional neural networks came out and so on. So there is always this thing, every time you see something which is hyped up, it has been done before, and it usually reaches a peak and then it sort of stagnates, which is where Gartner, which is how sort of Gartner or other such publications would like to compute their hype cycles. Correlation is not causation, but it's as close as we can get. Just because correlation, there are things on there are arguments on both sides of correlation and causation. People wouldn't want to report correlation just because it is not causation. That is as bad as saying that correlation implies causation. So you can see people on both sides of the extreme. And finally, one thing that Hans Rosling has a very interesting story about how people play the blame game. He was in his class and he was talking about how pharma companies are not making drugs more affordable. So one student gets really emotional and he says, punch them in the face. So Hans Rosling says, okay, really, next week I'm going to go to Novartis and give a talk. Who do you want me to punch? So the student says, punch the CEO. He said, the CEO is not likely to be there, but I will be meeting the board of directors. And there's 20 of them. How many of them do you want me to punch? So he says, okay, obviously by this time the student is dumbfounded. Then suddenly, other students start realizing what Rosling is trying to do. He's trying to figure out a way of letting the students take the problem higher than what it seems like. Then somebody points out that, hey, Novartis is a public company. So the board of directors or the CEO doesn't decide what to do, right? So who should you again punch in the face? Then another student says rich people, because rich people buy stocks in Novartis, major companies. But then Hans Rosling tells them that, do you know that pharma stocks tend to be very stable? Wars may happen, oil prices may go up and down, but people still need cancer treatment. That is why pharma stocks tend to be very, very stable. So who would invest? What rich person would invest in a low risk stock? Then it turns out that the answer is that majority of Novartis shareholders are basically retirement portfolios. Do you want to punch your grandmother in the face? That's basically how he concludes that conversation. The point is, it's easy to change, it's easy to shift blame simply between parties, but there is always a deeper, structure or a system under the problems that we see. This is an example again of how you can do proof by a contradiction. There was a paper in Science which says that soon in the near future, well, not in the near future, but maybe 100 years from now, women are going to outrun men in athletics. And this doesn't make sense because it's not a linear model. It's supposed to be an exponential model, because according to this model, just 20 years down the line, men and women will both have negative timings when they try to run the 100-meter dash. So you can always use these tools to sort of try and reduce something to an absurd conclusion and then debunk it, right? Ultimately, I would like to finish off with this quote from Hans Rosling, which says that look for causes, not villains. This is what he says in response to people, the tendency to blame people for bad analytics or bad policy or bad anything, right? Look for system, not heroes. Similarly, it's basically systems that make things work. It's brave and patient servants of a functioning society, rarely ever mentioned, are the true saviors of the world. These are people who are never going to be reported, but it's people who basically support institutions and people who keep things running silently behind the scenes. That's what politicians love, inaugurating buildings, right? But it's it takes a lot more to just keep that building running and that hospital functioning or the schools running. That's broadly the point of those books. There is a fairly longish reading list I wanted to share with you, which I will later if you want. Looping me, and if there are any questions, let me know. So yeah, that's about it.
Thank you, Jadip. That was very interesting.
Most welcome. So, all right.
Great session. Thanks.
I'll hang around if there are any questions. Otherwise, we're done. Or questions, comments, thoughts, feedback, anything is welcome.
So in the doctor's example, I don't remember which book I read this in.
Which one?
Which is on the doctor's example. Someone mentioned that would you like to go to a 5-rated doctor or a 2-rated doctor, right? So but what I remember reading was, if someone is being rated so high, which means that they're not taking up enough challenges. Challenging cases. This is more from a doctor management perspective. And someone who has a lower rating may be trying that, and they might know more. Yeah.
Perhaps.
Do they have any recommended readings for, biases that are very common? We do have a whole lot of biases, but to start off with,
Thinking Fast and Slow. That is a brilliant book. It's extremely difficult. I have managed to read. So every month I go and read one chapter. It's that difficult, and I've managed to read only half of it.
Another good one is The Art of Thinking Clearly.
Yeah,
Rolf DeBolly. Anybody who want, I can send a.
Oh yeah, I remember you recommending me that. That's an excellent book. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is like simple 1-page chapter, so it doesn't get heavy on reading.
Oh, and yeah, this is a book that basically inspired me to do this session. Brilliant book. Apart from Factfulness, of course. Yeah. There is a book called The Book of Why. One question that everybody has is, a correlation is not causation is fine, but then what is causation? And the answer is, we don't know. There is no data-driven technique to infer causation as such.
Yeah.
It's just
I
not.
think that has been one of the major questions that everybody tries to find out. What is the procedure to do this thing, X, Y, Z thing?
So on Twitter, there are three people broadly who have this, I like to call it a love triangle, but it's a love-hate triangle. One is Jan LeCun, the other is Julia Pearl, who's the author of the book Why, and a pretty big guy in symbolic AI and AI in general. And the third person is Gary Marcus, who is a massive critic of deep learning, because he thinks of deep learning as just deep learning without any extra smartness or without any deeper insight, right?
Yeah.
It's just like an overdeveloped brain. That's all it is. That's what he thinks of deep neural networks. And you pick any pair of them and you go on Twitter, they'll probably be fighting with each other. Jan LeCun, from a deep learning, he'll defend the deep learning perspective, obviously. Julia Pearl will say that, yeah, all that is fine, but there is no causal inference here. You don't know what causes what is it that causes things to learn. And Gary Marcus says that, okay, I tried out GPT-3 and it didn't make sense to me. It stopped making sense after 5 sentences. So
one of the things that has helped me, gain a little bit of interest is to understand the role of our limbic system in our decision making. How dominant our limbic system, basically our native urges that we have of survival and the rest of the stuff, and how much it influence our larger decisions in life also. So,
let's do another experiment that reminds me.
Yeah.
Actually, surprisingly, and I'm not making this up, the last time I checked my IQ, it turned out to be 128, 132 something. It doesn't make sense to me at all. Apparently that is more than what Richard Feynman has. So am I smarter than Richard Feynman? Clearly not. And you see, I said that, okay, if I were to tell my parents that I am qualified to be a member of Mensa, am I really? I don't know. And even if I am I smart?
But then,
no.
Jaidev, this is also interesting question. How the test, while these Mensa or any other standardized IQ test, the structure may not have changed, but our paradigm of understanding and knowledge has changed dramatically.
That's what I was coming to.
Right?
When you are talking about a smart machine, it simply means that the machine can do ALU operations, arithmetic and logic operations, faster. That's all. Faster doesn't mean smarter. Because there are so many other things. There is creativity, there is imagination, and so on.
It's simple.
I fit in more and more switches on the same size of a chip. It makes my computer faster. Faster does not mean smart.
Other thing, you look at teens these days. If you have nephews, nieces, or neighbors, just look at teens, and every time I look at 13, 14-year-old today, I feel dumb in comparison. And that does not mean in an absolute sense they know more than what we do. But when you compare relatively, they are far smarter than we were as late as 5 years back. That is about 15 years back.
That is actually happening. There was a very famous, not a very famous, I would say, but so Freakonomics Radio did a podcast series on self-improvement. There was an entire month where it was just about self-improvement. In the very first episode, they talked about how the gold standard for Olympics 100 meters dashed has ridiculously increased in fact over the last 100 years. The greatest virtuosos, musical virtuosos of 20, 30 years ago would not be admitted in schools today. Because they have been outaged by children today, or but on the other hand, I also see things decreasing. For example, I would love to complain that the kind of GSOC candidates we are getting these days is nothing compared to what I would see back in my day and so on.
Or what Sandeep was mentioning, at 99.9% you will not get admitted to SRCC.
maybe what we are doing is we are selectively breeding for better and better performance as a species.
But I think the irony over that is that better performance would always be tied to a context, and the context would always change, right? So what you consider smart in a given condition might not be smart in another one.
Precisely.
So do we have any accepted definitions in the corporate world when somebody says, okay, can we have a smart policy in place or a smart strategy in place.
कुछ नहीं हो सब.
Mm.
There's no smart strategy. See, another thing, another book I would like to recommend for those who've not read is Fooled by Randomness. This is by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who's also written Black Swan and Skin in the Game.
Anti-fragile. Yeah.
And it's a fantastic book, and it tries to say that we sometimes try to find, for example, what Jaydev was talking about, causality and causation and correlation, all that. Sometimes we try to overfit these models and try to draw unnecessary parallels. Sometimes they are pure chance, sometimes just pure chance. If you want to understand probability and randomness, this is an interesting book. The writer writes a little bit arrogantly, but he is very knowledgeable, so maybe we can bear with that arrogance for a while.
A lot of people actually criticize him a lot on Twitter because of his.
And I like one of his quote. I really like, not from this book. I think that's from Skin in the Game, I guess. That was there are 3 addictions in world: heroin, carbohydrate, and monthly salary.
Yeah,